Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. Before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday, as well as upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well. So make sure you are subscribed. Now, as you guys can tell by the title of today's episode, we have a wild case to cover today. I mentioned to you guys a couple weeks ago that we are dedicating the month of July to sadistic and sinister stalkers, and this case definitely falls into that category without a shadow of a doubt. Now, I do want to mention that there is something slightly different about this case in comparison to the ones that we have covered recently, and that is that this case is also a survival story. So even though it also falls into the category of sinister stalkers, we are also talking about a survival story as well. Today we are talking about the case of Mary Stauffer as well as her daughter Beth Stauffer and what they endured during their 53 days of captivity by a sadistic stalker. So with that being said, let's jump right on into it today. Mary Stauffer was born in 1944 in Duluth, Minnesota. She and her family moved to Hermantown, Minnesota when she was 10 years old, and Mary, as well as the rest of her siblings, graduated from Hermantown High School before Mary went on to attend Bethel College. Now, Bethel College was located in St. Paul, Minnesota, and while Mary was there, she ended up meeting a man named Irving Stauffer, also known as Irv. Now, Irv at the time was a seminary student and was working towards going on his first mission. Now, if you don't know, mission trips are what some Christians will go on. They will travel to different places all around the world with the goal of spreading the word of God and bringing people closer to God by volunteering, praying with locals, or other activities. Now, Irv and Mary really bonded over their religion. Their faith was extremely important to both of them. And so because of that, they knew that they both wanted to go on this mission trip together. And that trip was going to be going to the Philippines. Now, prior to going on this mission trip, Mary had graduated from Bethel College and she began working as a math teacher for ninth graders at a school called Alexander Ramsey High School. Mary very much enjoyed teaching and she excelled at it. Her students loved her and she was a highly respected teacher by her colleagues and her students. Now, Mary left her teaching job in 1967, and that is when her and Irv went to the Philippines as missionaries during 1967 and 1968. Now, after the mission trip, the two returned back to Minnesota, where Mary continued teaching for a few years afterwards before the family moved to Polk, Nebraska. Now, while in Polk, Irv was working as a Baptist minister before becoming a pastor. Now, while he only agreed to being a pastor for 2 years, that's all that he decided to sign on for at the time. But what him and Mary did not realize at the time was that the two of them would be staying in Polk, Nebraska for the next 5 years. And they also expanded their family during that time. Mary and Irv had 2 children during that time. They had their daughter Beth and their son Stephen. Beth was the oldest and she was 4 years older than her little brother, and the family stayed in Nebraska until 1975 when they decided it was time to go back to the Philippines and complete another 4-year mission. When they went to the Philippines this time, they continued to spread the word of God. This time, their main focus was building churches. After the 4 years, they returned back to Minnesota and moved to the town of Arden Hills, where they lived in Baptist missionary housing apartments, and they always had plans to return back to the Philippines in several years. So that is a little bit of the background of the Stauffer family. They were incredibly religious and faith-driven. They were a tight-knit family that was living their lives, enjoying all of the little moments, not knowing knowing what was to come, because while Mary was out living her life and enjoying her family and raising her children, what she didn't know is that she was being watched, stalked, and preyed upon by someone she had met years prior. Mary was being stalked by a student of hers, and this student was one of her math students at the Alexander Ramsey High School, and that student's name was Ming Sen Xiu. Ming was born on October 15th, 1950 in Taiwan to his parents, May and Jim. They moved to Minnesota when Ming was 8 years old after his father had gotten a job working as a professor at the University of Minnesota. Jim worked as the head of the forestry department at the University of Minnesota and was offered this role after his success in being a forestry researcher in Taiwan. He also wrote dozens of research articles and even designed the continuous forest inventory system, which was a method used in monitoring forest resources that's actually still used to this day. May also worked at the university as a math professor. However, she stepped down when she got pregnant with her second and then third son. Now, when Ming's family moved to Minnesota, they moved into the town of Roseville, and Roseville was a quiet suburban community. The Xius ended up buying a small white house on the corner of a street called Hemlin Avenue, and for all things considered, they really were living out the American dream. Now, sadly, Ming's father, Jim, ended up passing away 3 years after moving to the United States from cancer. Now, it was said that on his deathbed, Jim was having a conversation with Ming and told Ming that since Jim was nearing the end of his life, and because Ming was the eldest child and he was also the eldest son, Ming was going to have to step up into a whole new realm of responsibilities. He was going to have to be the man of the house. He was going to have to take care of his mother and younger brothers. He was going to have to be the protector. Now, during this conversation, Ming reassured Jim that he would be able to step up into this role and take on being the man of the house. However, the definition of what Ming thought being the man of the house was definitely got lost in translation, because after his father's death, Ming became very violent and controlling towards his siblings. He would force them to wait on him hand and foot, and when that did not happen, he would physically assault and beat them. Every single day after school, Ming had taught his brothers that they were forced to meet him at the front door and carry his books into his bedroom. They also had to take his socks and shoes off of him and make his favorite soup that they would place in front of the TV and turn the channel for Ming to whichever program he wanted to watch. And again, if his brothers ever fought him back on this or gave Ming some pushback, Ming would resort to violence. He would resort to beating them. And Ming's younger brothers did go to May, their mother, about this and expressed why this was making them upset, expressed what was happening. However, May would tell them that Ming was taking care of them and taking care of the family. He was stepping up into this man of the household type of role, and that the younger brothers had to respect him. Now, things began to escalate when Ming turned 14 years old. This is when his behavior really began to shift. And in July 1964, at this time, Ming said that he began to feel what he called pressures. And according to Ming, these pressures were in his head and they would cause him to do strange things. It really was his reasoning behind a lot of his behavior. He would blame these pressures that he was having. Now, one of the main behaviors that Ming was exhibiting through these pressures was arson. He was lighting things on fire. He was lighting fires in apartment buildings. And when police would question him about the arson, Ming would say that he physically could not control himself. He was not able to talk himself out of what he was doing at the time. Now, he was given a psychiatric exam at the University of Minnesota, and during this time, doctors met with May, his mother, several times to try and get an understanding of Ming's behavior over the past couple years. Now, May did confide in the doctors and told them that Ming had exhibited some behavior that definitely was alarming and concerning to her, her as a mother. May claimed that for the past 6 months, her son Ming had been sneaking into her bedroom in the middle of the night while she was sleeping. And on one of these occasions, she claimed she woke up from a deep sleep with Ming underneath the blankets of her bed with a flashlight after he had cut a hole in the crotch of her pajamas and was examining her genital area. Now, as you can imagine, this was incredibly disturbing. Disturbing isn't even the right word for that type of behavior. And so May was expressing to the doctors that he was exhibiting behavior that was not normal. What was happening was not normal. And this was obviously very disturbing for the doctors as well to hear. And after examining Ming, doctors agreed that he was in fact mentally disturbed and needed psychiatric help. They wanted him to be admitted to a long-term residential facility at the University of Minnesota's hospital. And they did end up doing this for several weeks. He was staying in this residential psychiatric facility for several weeks, working on getting help and working towards getting better. However, something happened between the social worker and the doctors in this case. Something got lost in translation, and to this day, it's not clear what exactly happened. However, the social worker did not communicate with the juvenile court properly about the doctor's recommendations for treatment. So because of this, Ming was discharged from probation and from his treatment as a whole at this point. So Ming went from getting a psychiatric evaluation to being put in a long-term residential facility, a facility that he was living in to get help at day in and day out. And then something got lost in translation and he completely was freed from this facility. He got to go home and he got to, for all things considered, be back in society as a whole again. Now, right after his release from the program is when Ming went back to school and had Mary Stauffer as his teacher in his algebra class. So that is the timeline. He gets released from the program, immediately goes back to school, and is put into this algebra class where Mary Stauffer is his teacher. And this is really where the obsession with Mary began. Ming had convinced himself that he was in love with Mary and that Mary was in love with him, which, by the way, just in case this needs to be clarified, this was a completely false reality. But Ming had never expressed this obsession outwardly. None of his friends, classmates, family, or Mary herself caught on to the obsession that was rapidly growing. If Ming was not in class with Mary, he was outside of class fantasizing about a life with her. He spent lots of time writing fantasy stories about his sexual desires. He glorified the idea of the traditional 1950s mother, someone who was modest and conservative and everything that Mary Stauffer was. But again, you would really never know it at the time. Ming seemed on the outside like a very normal student. He excelled academically in his 11th and 12th grade year. He even won a science project at the Minnesota State Science Award. He graduated high school with honors, and he was number 1 out of a class of 503 and voted by his classmates as most likely to succeed. So everyone around Ming viewed him as someone who was incredibly smart, incredibly intelligent, and someone who had a very bright future ahead of him. But right after graduating high school, Ming shocked everyone when he ended up failing out of college. Now, after failing from college, he decided to go on to a new avenue, which was opening up his own business. Ming started his own electronics business called Sound Equipment Services, and he hired a team of people to help run this business with him. And the people that worked with Ming, the employees of him, claimed that Ming definitely kept to himself. He only talked with them about business, what was going on at the company, what was going on at work, and really never let any of them into his personal life. Now, one could argue that because of that, because Ming spent a lot of time just focusing on his business and not talking about his personal life, the business that Ming had started really excelled. It succeeded at a rapid rate, and Ming was doing amazing as a business owner. This was something that not a lot of people expected. Ming had always been very smart. Obviously, like we just said, he was number 1 out of a class of 503. However, dropping out of college and starting a business, people didn't really know what to expect. So when this business really was starting to take off, Ming and his family were very, very excited and happy. Now, Ming's success did lead him to several other job offers and opportunities from other businesses. However, these positions were going to be out of state, and Ming absolutely refused to leave Minnesota. And the main and only reason for that was because he wanted to remain close with Mary Stauffer. Ming's obsession with Mary continued all throughout his high school career, into the beginning of his college career, and far afterwards as well into starting his business. There was never a time since Ming met Mary that he did not obsess over her, that he was not fascinated over her, that he did not create a false reality in his head that included her. So he did not want to go anywhere that he would not be with her. He wanted her to be close enough in proximity to where he could have her whenever he wanted. In Ming's free time, he would follow Mary every single place that she went. He would follow her to the grocery store. He would go to the church services that Mary attended and sit right behind her in these services. He would even park near the bus stop where Mary's children took the bus to and from school just to see Mary send off her kids. And then he would go home and he would write about these sexual fantasies that he was having with Mary. He would write about a life with Mary. Now, you might be sitting here wondering, how did Mary not put the pieces together? How did Mary not notice that she was being followed? How did Mary not know that the same man that was in the grocery store with her, was sitting behind her at church, was following her to her children's bus stop? How did the pieces not come together? However, you have to think it had been quite some time since the 9th grade class that Mary taught Ming in. It had been years at that point. There were a lot of kids in the high school. She taught a lot of different students, and to go years later, Ming doesn't exactly look the same as he did at the time. And along with that, he wasn't memorable enough for Mary to point him out each and every time he was following her. I think it's also something to be said that Mary also didn't think that she had to worry about being followed. She wasn't concerned about someone following her and watching her or her family. It never was a thought in her mind. It was never something that she thought could happen to her. Now, I do want to take a second and talk about the stories that Ming would write about these sexual fantasies that he was having, because the plot was typically always the same to some degree. In these stories, Ming would talk about how there was a woman of higher social status, and then Ming would come along and the woman would have an overpowering lust for him, and he would either have to be forceful, whether that was consensual or not, and they would have this sexual encounter, and he always described them each and every time as wearing white lingerie. Now, in most of these stories, Ming would write about how these women either had husbands or they had boyfriends, they were taken. However, the men that they were with were not able to satisfy these women sexually. So Ming would basically come in and save the day and be their sexual superhero. And then they would be obsessed with Ming, want to have his children, want to start a life with him. That was pretty much the sequence and series of events in almost every single story that Ming wrote about. So now I want to fast forward to when Ming was 23 years old, because at this time, Ming was still living at home. He was living at home with his siblings and his mom. However, his mom, May, had recently gotten remarried to a man, and the two of them moved to Virginia. However, she decided that she was going to keep the house that she had in Minnesota. That way, Ming could live there as well as her other two sons, and it would be a place that they could stay. She didn't want to leave the house and then have to kick all of her children out as well. She thought it would be best if they could also stay in the house. And really the only condition that she spoke about with Ming was that he would take care of the utilities, the taxes on the house, and basically the overall upkeep of the home. And with those being done, she was going to keep the house and allow Ming to live in it. And in 1979, Ming's two younger brothers ended up moving out of the house. So Ming really was the only person that was consistently living in the house at the time. And as you can imagine, Ming loved being able to live in this house by himself, because now he was able to do and free to do whatever he wanted. Not that he didn't before, but now he didn't feel like he had to necessarily hide what he was doing, because what no one else knew was at this point, Ming was in the process of planning something very, very sinister, and he was going to need the space to do it. Now, even though it had been 15 years at this point, since Ming had had Mary as a teacher, Ming felt like he had waited long enough, and now he was officially ready to be with Mary. Now, you might be sitting there wondering, why now? Why was this the time that Ming decided that he was going to act on his obsession? Now, the catalyst for this was that Ming had attended a church service that Irv was leading. Again, like I said, he liked to follow Mary to these churches. He liked to sit right behind her. It was a part of the stalking that he did. Now, while he was at a specific service, Irv had said and announced that him and his family were going back to the Philippines for a 4-year missionary assignment. And this was when Ming knew that he needed to act fast. It was no longer sitting around and obsessing over Mary in his house by himself. He could not handle the idea of Mary leaving for 4 years. So again, that was the catalyst that put him into action. So the Stauffer family was set to leave to the Philippines on Wednesday, May 21st, 1980. And in the days leading up to this trip, they were spending all of their time packing. They were getting themselves ready, doing all of the things necessary before embarking on another 4-year journey. And it was because it was so hectic, everything was so busy, the Stauffers didn't realize that they were being watched and stalked in these days leading up to their departure. Now, in the days leading up to them leaving, someone had attempted to break into their apartment twice. However, they were unsuccessful in doing so. And even though the Stauffers did file police reports for this, nothing ever came of it because police could not figure out who was attempting these break-ins. They thought it was very odd that the Stauffer home was the only one that had had these break-ins. No other apartment in the complex had been having these break-ins. There was no surveillance at the time. There was just nothing that could link anyone to these break-ins. So because of that, it was a dead end. So now we're going to move to Friday, May 16th. Again, this was 5 days prior to the departure of the Stauffer family. Now, on this day at approximately 3:45 p.m., Mary and her daughter Beth were running around finishing up some last-minute errands before they set out to the Philippines. At 3:45, Mary and Beth left their apartment and drove to Carmen's beauty salon. Now, little did Mary and Beth know that Ming was following them. Mary and Beth arrived at the beauty salon. They parked their car, they went inside, Beth got her hair cut, and the two exited the salon, not knowing that Ming was waiting right outside for them. Now, bystanders claimed that around this time, they saw a man fitting Ming's description. He was wearing a heavy leather jacket and was running around the parking lot in a very odd and bizarre manner. He was running around, crouching behind bushes, trying to seem like he didn't want to be seen. He was trying to make himself, not be seen by whoever he was hiding from. He just was exhibiting very odd and weird behavior. And even though it did catch the eyes of some, no one thought too much of it. They just thought that he was acting bizarre. Now, Mary and Beth left the beauty salon at 4:30 p.m. and began walking to their car. Now, it was on their way back to the car that Ming ran up behind Beth, pressed his gun to her head, and told Mary that he needed a ride. Now, Mary at the time was trying to keep calm. She told Ming that she would take him wherever he needed to go. However, he ordered Mary to get into the driver's seat while Ming squeezed into the front seat, the passenger seat, with Beth. He pointed the gun at Mary and told her to drive. Now, Mary again was following Ming's instructions. She was trying to remain calm, and Mary tried asking Ming if he was in trouble because they were Christians and they could try and help him. She told Ming that they were going to be expected to be home soon and that her husband would get worried if they weren't. Now, Ming has always said that kidnapping Beth, Mary's daughter, was never a part of the plan. His plan all along was to kidnap Mary and Mary only, but Ming decided that he really had no other choice because he didn't see another opportunity that would arise to take just Mary. Now, he did say at this point he was shocked to see that Mary did not recognize him, because at this point she did not. From the very beginning, she seemed like she didn't know who Ming was and she did not remember him, and this only angered Ming more. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that he had been obsessed with this woman for 15 years and she did not remember him at all. Now, ultimately, after driving for some time, Ming ordered Mary to pull off into a deserted area and turn off the car. He then forced Mary and Beth into the back seat and tied their hands with rope and duct tape before telling them to get into the trunk of the car. So now they've gone from the front of the car in the driver and passenger seat to the back of the car to get restrained, and now they are in the trunk of the car. And when Ming closed the trunk, he got into the driver's seat and began driving. Now, at this point, Mary and Beth were trapped in the back of the car. However, they were continuously praying. They started calling out different prayers, praying that they would get home safely, praying that the Lord would be with them during this time. And because their mouths were not duct taped, they were able to speak freely. And Ming was able to hear them praying in the trunk of the car. And this started to really irritate him. So he drove off to the side of the road again, stopped the car, opened the trunk, and then duct taped both Mary and Beth's mouths. That way he would not be able to hear them whatsoever. Mary claims that for the next several hours, Ming was driving around aimlessly. She had no idea where she was going. She had no idea where Ming was taking them to. However, Ming would stop every so often to check on Mary and Beth and make sure their restraints were still in place. And in order to enforce that, he ended up placing the spare tire on top of both of them in an effort to not let them move. He wanted them to stay still and not be able to try and wiggle out of their restraints. Now, at this point, we are now at about 6:30 p.m. on May 16th. While this was happening, while Ming was placing the spare tire on top of Beth and Mary, there was a little boy who had walked up to the car, because what Ming did not realize is that he had parked at a nearby playground in order to do this. So there were kids at this playground, and one of these kids was named Jason Wilkman. And Jason had walked up to the trunk of Ming's car and asked Ming what he was doing. However, before Jason, who at the time was 6 years old, was even able to finish his sentence, Ming grabbed him and threw him in the trunk of the car with Mary and Beth before slamming the trunk door, getting back in the car, and driving off. Now, like I said, Jason was 6 years old, and at this time, he was at the park with his friend Timmy. Now, Timmy saw the entire abduction go down because he was at the front of the car. So he saw his friend Jason get thrown into the trunk. And when that happened, Timmy ran home to Jason's house, where his mom also was, because Jason's mom and Timmy's mom were catching up. They were just enjoying their time together while their boys were at the playground. Now, when Timmy ran home, he was hysterically crying and told both his mom and Jason's mom that Jason had been taken. Now, police were immediately called and an investigation started, but at this point, it was too late. Ming had driven off with Jason in the trunk with Beth and Mary, and they drove around for a few more hours before Ming eventually stopped the car, opened the trunk, grabbed Jason, and slammed the trunk back shut. Now, what Beth and Mary did not know at the time was that when Ming took Jason out of the car, he then beat him to death with a metal rod before leaving his body out in a deserted area and driving away. Now, Mary did try to ask Ming what he did with Jason. However, Ming tried to say that he let Jason go, that he dropped him off in a public place to be reunited with his family. However, the truth is that Ming brutally murdered him. Now, at around 9:30 p.m. So they had been driving around for several hours at this point. At 9:30 p.m., Ming ends up transferring Mary and Beth from Mary's car into a van that Ming had parked. Now, after they transferred vehicles, Ming drove around for several more hours until 11:55 p.m. when he parked outside of his home. Now, one by one, Ming brought both Mary and Beth, who were blindfolded at this time, into the house and put them in the bedroom closet. Now, there was something that stood out to Mary during the beginning stages of her abduction, and that was the fact that Ming kept referring to Mary by her name. He kept calling her by her name, leading Mary to believe that Ming knew who she was, but she did not know him. She kept asking Ming, "Who are you? How do you know my name? How do you know me?" But Ming never answered her. Now, back at Mary's house, Irv did contact the police at 7:30 p.m. that night and said that Mary and his daughter Beth never made it home from the hair salon. Now, at first, police were not worried. They said that it had only been a couple hours. This did not constitute any worry for Mary and Beth actually being missing. However, at 9:30, Irv called again, saying that they still were not home. But again, police still didn't see it as a concern. It wasn't until 10:45 p.m. that night when police started to put the pieces of the puzzle together that there had also been an abduction of a little boy, 6-year-old Jason Wilkman, earlier that day. They immediately decided to go ahead with the investigation of Mary and Beth. They went to the Stauffer apartment and asked Irv if he knew who Jason Wilkman was. However, Irv denied it, said that he had never heard of the boy before. Now, what police did learn through talking to Timmy, the boy who was with Jason at the park, was that the description of the car that Jason was placed into matched the description of Mary's car. Now, because of this, police decided that more than likely these cases were connected, and police decided to set out on their search the following morning. But what police did not know was at this time, Mary and Beth had been kidnapped by a man who had been obsessively stalking Mary for 15 years. Now, for the majority of the time that Mary and Beth were held captive, they were held inside of Ming's bedroom closet. The closet that they were being kept in was a 3x5 closet in Ming's bedroom that was covered in beige carpeting. It was clear that the closet had been cleaned out before Mary and Beth had been brought in there, and inside the closet there were only 2 blankets, a pillow, and an empty bucket for them to use as a toilet. Now, on the first full day of captivity, Ming took Mary out of the closet, leaving Beth inside. He brought her into the living room where he tied her hands to the couch and had a video camera rolling. The next 3 hours, Ming videotaped his conversation with Mary. Essentially, this entire conversation was Ming trying to get Mary to remember who he was. However, he started fabricating stories about his entire life. At one point, he told Mary that he was in the Vietnam War. Another point, he told Mary that she gave him a horrible grade on an assignment that basically started the downward spiral of his life, which was a lie, by the way. Now, Mary could not remember Ming during this conversation. She was not able to remember. She kept telling Ming that she taught so many students, and the students that she did remember were mainly the ones that were the troublemakers, the more rebellious students. And all that really did was make Ming more angry, because for Ming, he was only hearing that Mary only cared about the bad students in the classes, the ones that caused trouble, the ones that were disruptive, and that she wasn't paying attention or caring to the ones who were actually good students. Now, ultimately, this conversation of Ming trying to get Mary to remember led to nothing, and it ended with Ming ultimately raping Mary before putting her back into the closet. Now, later that day, Ming took Mary out again, videotaping a second conversation, and this one also lasted for several hours. And in this conversation is when Ming finally revealed his identity to Mary. And even when Ming revealed his identity, Mary really didn't remember Ming that much, other than just a minor recollection. And throughout the conversation, Mary tried talking Ming out of keeping her and Beth hostage. And in order to appease Mary at the time, Ming continuously told her that he knew that her and her family were going to the Philippines on Wednesday, and he was planning on letting her and Beth free at that time. That way they would be able to go to the Philippines. However, this deal for Ming was contingent on Mary showing Ming love and affection. Now, from the very beginning, beginning and pretty much all through Mary and Beth's captivity, Mary never gave in to Ming. She never agreed to show him love and affection. She told him multiple times that she was married to Irv and that no matter what he did to her, it did not matter because that was her husband and that was the man that she loved. Now, at this point in the public, the news of Mary and Beth's abduction had spread and it was now taking over all of the media. And this caused Ming to panic. Now, he thought of pretty much everything to try and deter the media from talking about Mary and Beth's abduction. And he finally decided on a plan. And this plan was that Mary was going to write a letter to Irv, her husband, and basically claim that her and Beth were safe and everything was fine. And they just needed to take a little break from the family and they'd be back for their trip to the Philippines. The letter was set out on May 19th, and the following day, on May 20th, Irv received the letter. Now, inside the letter, Mary had written, quote, "We decided to drive to a quiet place and think for a while. It's been such a busy time with packing and trying to get ready to go that I just felt as though we needed time to rest and think," end quote. Now, Irv knew just as well as authorities knew that this letter was complete BS and that Mary and Beth were not okay. And so because of this, the investigation continued. Now, ultimately, Ming's plan of deterring the media by having Mary write this letter really backfired on him because for the days afterwards, the media's interest in this case only increased. The public now knew all about it. Everyone was talking about it. And so about 2 weeks after the initial abduction, we are on day 18, Ming had Mary write a second letter. In this letter, Mary apologized for not being able to come back in time to go to the Philippines, however, insisted that she and Beth were fine, again, trying to deter the media in any way that Ming could. However, again, when Irv and the police saw this letter, they did not believe it and their search did not stop. Now, back at Ming's house where Beth and Mary were being held in captivity, weirdly enough, things started to fall into a little bit more of a routine. Mary and Beth started to fall into a little bit more of a routine. Mary would give Ming a list of groceries to go out and buy, which he would. He would bring them back. Mary would cook dinner for the three of them, and they would all sit down and eat together. They would play card games, and for all things considered, it really did seem like a dream come true for Ming. However, I do want to point out that Mary and Beth were not allowed to freely roam around the house as they wished. Both Mary and Beth were chained to each other, and they were chained in whatever room they were in, whether that was the closet, the bedroom, the kitchen. Ming made sure that they were chained at all times. That way they would not be able to just try to escape whenever they wanted. Now, even though things did seem to fall into a little bit of a routine, this was purely based off of survival skills more than anything else. It was just Mary and Beth's attempt to survive. During this time, Mary was still being sexually assaulted and raped by Ming almost every single night. And during this time, Mary really held on to her faith throughout all of this. It was what kept her going. It is what saw her through this really, really dark and horrific time. She and Beth prayed every single night. And during the assaults, Ming would get mad if Mary was not acting like she wanted him or not fulfilling these fantasies that he had. Like I mentioned earlier, Mary never strayed away from the fact that she was married to her husband and she was not an active participant in her own sexual assaults, in her own rapes. She always told Ming that she loved her husband. The only person she wanted to be with was her husband, and that anything he was doing to her, anything that Ming was doing to her, was non-consensual and it was rape. And this, as you can imagine, only made Ming more angry because he was not fulfilling out these fantasies that he always had with Mary. He was confused as to why Mary would not want to be with him, why she was not also living up to these fantasies that he had played out in his head. So now we're at day 31 of captivity, and surprisingly, something happened that no one was expecting. On day 31 of captivity, it was actually Father's Day, and Ming allowed Beth to call Irv and wish him a happy Father's Day. Now, the call was recorded, and during the call, Beth did not say much during it. All she said was that her and Mary were okay, but they didn't know when they were coming home. Now, it should be also noted that the police were not able to track or trace this call to find where it was coming from. And Ming was also watching Beth make this phone call, so she could only say so much at the time. Now, a few days later, on June 20th, it was Mary's birthday, and the three of them celebrated. Ming picked up a birthday cake and cards for Mary. They sang her happy birthday, and Mary blew out the candles on her cake. Again, for Mary, it was all about surviving. It was about surviving each and every day with her daughter, making sure that her and her daughter were safe, and she would do anything she had to do in order for that to be the case. Now, at this point, it was very clear that Ming was becoming more comfortable and almost putting his guard down a little bit more. On July 4th, Ming took Beth and Mary to go watch fireworks at a popular campsite. However, he did threaten that if they drew any suspicion, he would kill them. Both Beth and Mary obeyed Ming, and they returned back home later that night after watching the fireworks. Now, at this point, like I said, it's very clear Ming was not as high-strung with Beth and Mary as he once was. He wasn't on edge all the time, and because Beth and Mary had complied thus far, his trust in them grew, and he wasn't as strict. So now we're at July 7th, 1980. On this specific day, Ming went off to work, and Mary and Beth were moved into a different closet. Now, this closet was a bigger closet, so the two of them had more space. The closet was big enough for one of them to sit in it and then another one to sit right outside of it. Ming put a little chair right outside of the closet, so one could sit in the closet and one could sit on the chair. He also put a TV in this closet. That way Beth could watch some of her cartoons. Now, on this particular day, at approximately 3 p.m., Beth was in the closet watching cartoons on the TV while Mary was sitting directly outside of it. Now, something was different on this day, and that was that Mary began to notice something about the door. Now, like I said, this was a different closet, so the structure of it was a little bit different than the one that she and Beth had previously been hiding in. And the thing that Mary noticed about this door specifically was the door hinges. Mary started getting flashbacks of when she was a child and she used to watch her father take out the hinge pins of the door. Now, because of that, Mary decided that she was going to try and pry her way off of the door. Remember, at this point, they are chained. They are chained to the door, so she's trying to figure out a way for her and Beth to be able to free themselves. Now, at this time, she began messing with the door hinge, and that is when she was able to pull the pins out of the door. And just like that, Mary and Beth were not chained to the door any longer. Now, they were still chained to one another, but the chain was no longer attached to the door, which left them the freedom to roam around the house. Now, at this time, Mary knew that she needed to act extremely fast for several reasons. The main one being she did not know when Ming was going to be returning from work, so she knew that whatever she was about to do had to happen very, very quickly. And that is when she tried immediately walking into the kitchen to grab the phone. However, because she was still chained to Beth at the time, Beth was terrified that they were going to get caught, that they were going to get in trouble, and that Ming would hurt them. And she initially tried to stop Mary from going into the kitchen, tried to tell her that they shouldn't do it, that she was afraid. However, Mary insisted to Beth that this is what they needed to do in order to regain their freedom, in order to leave this house, in order to go back home. Beth needed to trust her mom in this moment that this was the right thing to do. Now, Beth ultimately agreed, and they walked into the kitchen together. Mary picked up the phone and called the police. When police answered, she told them what her name was and that her and her daughter had been held hostage by Ming for several weeks. Now, while on the phone with authorities, Mary told police that she didn't know when Ming would be returning home from work, and so when they arrive, to be cautious of that. She actually said, if you see his car in the driveway, do not come into the house because he had a lot of guns in the home. Mary claimed that she was worried that if police barged into the home, Ming would automatically reach for the guns and ultimately kill her and her daughter. Now, at this point, police told Mary to stay inside of the home and wait for them to get there because they were rushing over at this point. Now, they also told Mary to stay away from any windows that could be in sight. They didn't want Mary and Beth in any windows. That way, if they had to shoot into the house, they would not hit Mary and Beth. So after this phone call, Mary hangs up the phone and her and Beth anxiously wait for the police. And at this point, it was actually Beth who came up with the idea that her and her mom, Mary, should wait outside. She figured that if her and Mary waited outside in the backyard and Ming came home, he would automatically walk into the house expecting them to be there, but they would be able to escape because they would not be in the house. And Mary decided that this was actually a great idea. She agreed with this idea. So her and Beth walk out to the backyard, chained up together still. And when they did, they noticed that there was a car in the driveway. It was an old car. It was a car that was not being used, and it was covered by a blue tarp. And that is where Mary and Beth decided to hide out. They hid behind the car and waited for authorities to arrive. Now, it did not take long for police to arrive on the scene, secure the area, and spot Mary and Beth hiding behind the vehicle. Police then rescued Mary and Beth and took them to the hospital to complete a medical exam. And at this point, they were officially free from Ming. All in all, like I said in the beginning, Mary and Beth had been held captive for 53 days. Those days of captivity included Mary being sexually assaulted and raped almost every single day. During their time in captivity, Beth and Mary did everything that they had to do in order to survive, and ultimately it worked. And by a miracle, they were able to go home to their family. Now, while on the way to the hospital, police were asking Mary about Jason Wilcom, the 6-year-old boy who had been brutally murdered. Now, they were asking Mary if Jason was in the house, if he was still with her. And at this point, Mary was confused because, like I said in the beginning, when Ming took Jason out of the trunk of that car, he told Mary that he didn't hurt Jason and that he left him in a public area where Jason would ultimately be found. And it was in that moment that Mary and the police both realized that something horrible had happened to Jason, and police notified Jason's parents. So since police had rescued Mary and Beth and they were officially safe, it was time for police to go ahead and arrest Ming. They knew that he was at work based off of what Mary had told them, and so they went to his business and saw his car outside of the building. Now, police entered the building and asked the other employees where Ming was, and that is when employees pointed down to the basement where the workshop of the business was. At that point, police bombarded the basement, and that is when they saw Ming. They called out for his name, and that is when he turned around and immediately surrendered. Now, at first, Ming was saying things to police like, "What is this about? What are you doing here?" However, when Ming was being escorted out of the building and saw that police were talking to his employees, he kept assuring police that his employees had nothing to do with this. So at first he was saying he didn't know why he was arrested. However, then his tone changed and he claimed that his other employees were not responsible for this. Now, immediately after his arrest, Ming was brought to the police station, and this was the same station that Mary and Beth were being held at because they needed to have some questioning done on them as well. Police were asking them questions about what had happened during their time in captivity. And while Ming was being brought into the building, coincidentally enough, Beth and Mary were being escorted out of the building. So they actually crossed paths. So whoever was in charge of that definitely did not do a great job. However, they did cross paths while Mary and Beth were leaving and Ming was being escorted in. And during this time, Ming cried out to Mary, asking her why she ran away from him, but police continued escorting him inside. Now, after Ming's arrest, Ming's mother, May, ended up hiring the top defense attorney in Minnesota for him. She really was in a state of denial about what her son had done. And right away, police noticed something very interesting. They noticed a lot of similarities between Ming's mother as well as Mary Stauffer. Both of their names started with an M. And before Ming's second marriage, they also had the same letter of the beginning of their last name, that both of their last names started with the letter S, so they had the same initials, MS. Along with that, May also taught high school math for 10 years. So she was also a math teacher, just like Mary was. And if that was not enough, Mary was actually a student of Ming's mother. So May had taught Mary, and then Mary taught Ming. Now, Ming himself has admitted that he was drawn to Mary by some of the similarities that her and his mother shared. When talking to his mother after his arrest, he said, quote, "Mommy, she reminded me of you because of her spirit. She is bright and warm and a good person," end quote. Now, after Ming's arrest, May moved back to Minnesota and visited him in jail daily. Now, the trial for Ming began on September 9th, 1980 in a St. Paul, Minnesota courthouse. Now, Ming was being charged in this specific trial for the 2 counts of kidnapping. Now, during this trial, Ming pled not guilty by reason of insanity. So the prosecution was going to have to prove that Ming was not in his right state of mind when he committed these abductions and held both Beth and Mary hostage. Now, during this initial trial, I want to make this clear, there was no mention of Jason Wilkman. He was not talked about in this trial because this trial specifically was focusing on the kidnapping charges. Now, during this trial, the jury did see the videotapes that Ming made while he was talking to Mary. As I said in the beginning, when the first few days of captivity were happening, Ming had several conversations with Mary that he had video recorded, and those video recordings were played during the trial. And again, it was Ming talking about how he had been obsessing over Mary for years and years and years, 15 years at that point. He talked about his frustration about Mary not remembering him. He was bringing up all of these things. However, I do want to point out that the jury did not see the assault portions of those tapes. Like I mentioned, Mary had been raped and sexually assaulted during those videotapes. However, the judge and the court system had cut the tapes before the jury was able to see that. Now, Mary did take the stand during this trial, and she explained everything. She explained her family dynamic, her upbringing. She explained how her and the family were planning on going to the Philippines prior to the kidnapping to serve another missionary trip. She explained that what she experienced at the hands of Ming was absolutely horrific. She went into great detail about everything, and it's what I've explained to you today. Now, Beth also took the stand and did the exact same thing. Now, there were psychiatrists who took the stand that had evaluated Ming, and during the psych evaluations, Ming had taken an IQ test, and during that test, he scored an 135, putting him in the superior range, which is really only 1% of the general population. But even though Ming had an exceptionally high IQ, he was clearly a very, very smart man, Ming suffered from erotomania, which this is also known as stalker's disease. At the time that this trial was happening, this disorder had not been identified by the American Psychology Association. However, it since has. And people with this disorder create fantasies and delusions in their head that no matter how much evidence proves otherwise, they will always believe it to be true. All of the fantasies, all of the delusions, all of the stories that they are repeating to themselves over and over and over again, those will always be true to them no matter what. People with this disease reconstruct their lives to be around the person or the subject of their attraction. They will build sexual and romantic fantasies in their brain that to them, again, will always be true. Now, typically, people with erotomania do not become violent over the people that they're infatuated over unless someone or something threatens this relationship that they have made up in their head. It is then that they go into a fight or flight mode. So that was something that was also talked about during this trial. And after the trial was completed, the jury found that Ming was in fact guilty, and he was sentenced to 30 years to life with the probability, and this is the scary part, it was with the probability that he was going to be released at the 30 years. So that was his sentencing for the kidnapping trial. Now it was time for the second trial, and this trial in particular was for the murder of Jason Wilkman. Now, Jason and his defense team did come to a plea deal deal with the prosecution, and this deal was that Ming would agree to show the FBI where he put Jason's remains. However, in doing so, he wanted to negotiate his first-degree murder charge down to a second degree, which after much consideration, talking to Jason's parents, and a lot of negotiating, they did end up agreeing upon. Ming buried Jason in the Carlos Avery Preserve. It consists of brush, forests, and open fields. It took everyone 3 days to locate the exact area where Ming said he put Jason until finally they arrived at skeletal remains. Ming had not even buried Jason. He just left his body out. So his skeleton, blue pants, striped shirt, and one tennis shoe were all that remained. Now, Ming still had to be put on trial for this, and this trial began on January 14th, 1981, and Mary took the stand again for a second time during this trial. And during this trial, she's talked specifically about her interactions with Jason on the night of the kidnapping and the night of his murder. She explained that Jason was put in the trunk with her and Beth, and that once Ming took him out of the trunk, Mary never saw Jason again. Now, while Mary was in the middle of her testimony, something absolutely horrifying happened to her. Before Mary could get through her entire testimony, Ming, who was sitting at the defense table, jumped up, sprinted towards the witness box, and jumped on top of Mary, toppling her over in her chair. Now, somehow, some way, Ming was able to smuggle a knife into this courtroom, and he took his knife out while he was on top of Mary and slashed her face, screaming, "I just want to be with her one more time." Now, everyone in the courtroom at this point was screaming. It was utter chaos. Police were pulling Ming off of Mary, and Mary was rushed to the hospital where she was given 62 stitches for this. Now, the trial did proceed the following day, and Beth took the stand and gave her testimony about what she remembered that day. Irv also took the stand, and after all of the witnesses had been called, the prosecution and the defense rested their case, and the jury found Ming guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to an additional 40 years on top of the 30 that he had to serve for the kidnappings charge. So all in all, it was 70 years. Now, Ming did become eligible for parole in 2010. However, luckily, it was denied. Later that year, a judge declared that Ming should be detained indefinitely because he is a dangerous and sexual predator, which he denies. Ming is currently serving out his sentence in Marion, Illinois, and after the trials, Mary and her family did return back to the Philippines to continue their missionary work. Mary and Irv are still married and living in Minnesota, and their children have moved out and now have families of their own. And that, you guys, is this case. It is the survival story of Mary Stauffer and her daughter Beth. It is also the obsession and stalking case of Ming. I'm so curious to hear what you guys have to say about it. I'm curious to hear what you think about his sentencing and how long he was given the brutality of his crimes. Because personally, just looking at the kidnapping charge, 30 years does not seem enough for what he did. He did not just kidnap Beth and Mary, which, by the way, would still not be okay, and still, in my opinion, would not just warrant 30 years. He brutally tortured both of them, the mental torture, the physical torture, locked them in a closet for 53 days. They were held captive. Their lives were threatened every single day. 30 years does not seem enough for that, in my personal opinion, but I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about it. And with that being said, you guys, that is all for me today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah, and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Again, we post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday, and you guys are not going to want to miss it. I'll be back next week with a brand new one for you guys, and until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.